we have arrived at the last part of today's course, skepticism. Now, we're already familiar with a few skeptics, most notably David Hume, discussed last week. As you will recall, he talked about cause and effect, and we talked about him in the context of that Newtonian paradigm that, as Professor Hirschberlin explained, is no longer adequate to explain phenomena we want to talk about nowadays. Now, David Hume is a skeptic, but Nietzsche is a skeptic as well, though of a rather different stripe. What they have in common is that they ask us to look at things differently, to look at things skeptically, that is to say, poke through the taken for granted and bracket the self-evident in order to ask questions about the way we look at the world, often without thinking about it. This can be applied to our thinking of justice as well. Taking this sheep here as a representative of the herd, the sheep might say, where it comes to justice, what we do is punish criminals because justice needs to take its course. Nietzsche asks us to think about this rather skeptically and say, in all cases, is it really a desire for justice, or is justice another one of those words that is masking something much less noble, namely the desire to retaliate? You hurt me, and now I want to see you suffer. The pleasure we take in the suffering of others is something that comes out in, among other things, gossip magazines, where this tendency seems to have free rein, and people are in fact willing to pay good money to buy magazines like this. Now, you might not be particularly interested in Meghan Markle, but you've probably heard that she has been put through the ringer ever since she married Harry. Leaving aside the details of this affair, it's important to see what happens here, and what Nietzsche says marks much of the psychology of human beings, namely that we take pleasure in another person's pain, or that we take pleasure in putting down especially those people who we perceive as standing above us. Now, there's few people more above us traditionally than members of the royal house, which is why Meghan Markle is such a happy, well, not a happy subject, but a good subject for this kind of dynamic. Add to that, of course, elements of racism, and you have a concoction that led to a rampage in the British gossip magazines. Important to note here is this tendency that Nietzsche has to pay attention to the darker side of human nature, the things we don't like to own up to, but that often lurk behind or beyond these very noble-seeming virtues and values. We like to define ourselves in terms of human dignity, rationality, fairness, equality, etc. But in fact, we take pleasure in putting other people below us or going after them when we feel they have too much power or they are too far above us. It's essential to note here that, of course, these values that we are talking about can be truly valuable, but that much lies in their application, and again Nietzsche says it serves to look at their genealogy, to look at their history, to see how oftentimes we use beautiful language to justify what in fact isn't beautiful at all. So Nietzsche wants us to be skeptical, he wants us to be critical, he wants us to ask, who benefits from the moral or legal rules that we hold to be universal and that we feel should apply to everybody? Who benefits for them? And in fact, do they apply to everyone, or do they apply only to a group? Because as soon as we come up with a moral or legal system that applies only to one group, Nietzsche says we should be very wary of the people that don't belong to that group, or rather, we should be wary of our tendency to look at the outside group people as somehow less valuable, less worthy, right? He asks us to always be very critical of what he calls the herd instinct. Now, this is not to say that moral and legal rules aren't necessary for all the reasons explained to you last Wednesday. It's just that what we're doing today is we look at them skeptically and we ask, yes, these things are very important, but where are the pitfalls? Where can this kind of thinking be abused, and what is the history of this kind of language in the first place? Very important in that conversation is the language of normality. Who counts as normal? Who counts as the norm? And what do we do with people who don't stick to that norm, either because they cannot, or because they choose not to, or because they come from the kind of background that simply to us seems abnormal or not normal? So again, we're looking at the genealogy of morals, and you see, I hope, a connection here to last week's class, because again, we're talking about language and how certain words and certain concepts that we tend to use as universally applicable and as self-evidently referring to a particular bit of reality or a particular ideal that we think or we want to believe we all share. We're looking at language critically and asking questions about how this language came about in the first place and what purpose it serves. And as is apparent from the conversation so far, this has a lot to do with power. Language is not neutral. These are not neutral instruments that are just at our disposal and that don't change the way we look at things in using them. Language and morality has everything to do with power. Oftentimes, morality is defined by those in power, or, like Nietzsche says, it is used as a tool to gain power. To say that you are morally superior, or perhaps not to straight out say it, but to imply that you have moral superiority, puts you in a position over and often against those who you perceive not to have that superiority. There's a safety in that, there's a security in that, but there's also a real danger. With all this in mind, consider one of the quotes that you discussed on Wednesday. The combination of the rule of law and democracy is also directed against traditional rules that never have been put to the test of rational reflection. Right? Again, this is a quote from last Wednesday. When we think about it from the Nietzschean perspective, especially that bit about traditional rules stand out. Remember, we talked about the death of God, as I mentioned earlier in today's lecture as well, and in particular we talked about this quote: "The strength of knowledge does not depend on its degree of truth, but on its age." So if in fact a lot of things seem true because they have been true for a long time, or rather they have been deemed true for a long time, then you can see the important role of tradition here. When something is traditional, when something has simply been the case for a long time, we are tempted to accept it as true. And in fact, it might seem rational to accept it as true. So when we say we need to put traditional rules to the test of rationality, to the rational test, this can be much less apparent than it may at first seem, because often what is deemed rational is what is traditional. Last week we talked about freedom and the terrifying aspect of realizing that if in fact there are no universal values, because the source of these universal values has disappeared, we are radically free. That also means we are radically free to redefine values. They have been redefined in the past and they can be redefined again. Also cast your mind back to where we talked about Hume and inductive reasoning. Hume said that it may seem extreme, but that even the statement that the sun will rise in the morning is based on inductive reasoning. In other words, we hold it to be true because it has been true so far. It has been the case every morning so far in the history of the world, as far as we know, so we assume it's going to be true tomorrow. This is inductive reasoning, you could say traditional in that respect. But nobody doubts that the sun will rise will rise again tomorrow. Perhaps you doubt it in the metaphorical sense because there's a lot of trouble in the world, but that the actual sun will rise, we hold to be true simply because it's always been true so far. So back to that quote and the traditional rules that are mentioned there. How do we figure out which rules are traditional in this sense? And is rational actually better than traditional? And we can even ask, can we distinguish one from the other? Because oftentimes what seems traditional, or rather what seems rational, is in fact just traditional. It has been held to be true for a long time. This brings us back to that concept of angst. If we realize that our values, that our rules are all arbitrary, we may end up in that paralyzing state where we feel we have no grip on reality and no meaning is self-evident. Now, of course, this is an extreme kind of mood to be in. And in our day-to-day life, we want to, of course, trust on the rule of law, trust in the rule of law, and trust in justice, etc., and all the rules we have and all the values we share. But Nietzsche says it is important to at least every now and then ask these very profound questions. Because once we realize that from a position of angst, we crave certainty and we crave rules and we want to feel solidarity with those around us, once you realize how this psychological process works, you see how, of course, in times of angst, it is a perfect period for those who seek power to grasp it. If we're all looking for meaning, we tend to also look for people who can give us that meaning. In closing, you can probably see how this applies to today's situation as well. In times of angst, in times of fear right now, combined with angst around the coronavirus, it is of course very difficult to be skeptical. It is very difficult to be skeptical because skepticism tends to be easiest from a position of calm and relaxation. It's really easy to be a cynic if your life is very comfortable. For many of us right now, our lives are not comfortable at all. And what we crave when things are not comfortable and things are very uncertain, we crave certainty. Right? We want clear rules, we want clear regulations. So on the one hand, these rules and regulations, as we know on a national level, but also as far as the university policy goes, these rules and regulations keep shifting. And so they don't provide us with the certainty that we crave. Now, this is the kind of vacuum that, of course, lends itself to people who want to gain power, a vacuum that people who want to gain power can jump into by providing perhaps a false sense of certainty. You can think, for example, of President Trump, who's been using rather racist language surrounding the coronavirus, not saying, but kind of implying that it has to do something with people who are other from his perspective. This can provide a kind of certainty, but obviously it is one that is extremely morally problematic. Important for us to see here is that Nietzsche asks us to be skeptical about the values that we take for granted, whether these be straightforwardly moral values or perhaps values that are written down in the European Charter and have to do more with justice and the rule of law. It is not to say that these values are not important. It is simply to say that we need to always look at them with skepticism as well.